Persuasion socks, and on the bottom it says, know your own happiness. So I just got these at a store it was just a regular store. It was not like a Jane Austen anything, and this happened to be the only novel that they had Jane Austen socks in. So this is certainly the right moment to be wearing. So again, good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Alrighty. Happy Jane Austen's birthday. And again, thank you for coming, and thank you to Kristen and the Falmouth Public Library for inviting me on this auspicious occasion. And I want to start with a very, very brief bio of the birthday girl and her work. As you know, she was born 250 years ago today. Her father was an Anglican rector, and she was born in the town of Steventon. She was the youngest of 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. She and her sister Cassandra, to whom she was very close, never married. Jane began writing when she was very young, kind of to be her family's entertainment. You know, they didn't have Netflix, and they were very enthusiastic about her writing. She never stopped writing until her death in July of 1817, where she was in Winchester, England, and she's buried there in the cathedral. In her 41 years, she wrote 6 major novels, which are listed here. And when you're a Jane Austen person, people give you things, so they're also listed here. So she also wrote the Juvenilia, an epistolary novel called Lady Susan, which was later adapted as the film Love and Friendship. You might be more familiar with it through that. It's the most amazing portrait of a narcissist. There are 2 unfinished works, and then her letters. Alas, Cassandra burned a lot of her letters, so there's a lot we will never know about her life, though that doesn't stop people from speculating. The British literary critic Richard Jenkins has said that Jane Austen has possibly given pleasure to more men in bed than any other woman in history, except perhaps Agatha Christie. And I can certainly attest that the same goes for women. So I'm curious, how many of you have read all 6 novels? Gold stars. How many of you have read at least 3? Excellent. How many of you have reread one or more of the novels? Okay, see? Maybe at the end we can argue about which ones are the best. So there is a name for us, super fans. We're called Janeites, and it's a big fan club. And in case you'd like to join, it's called, as Kristen mentioned, it's the Jane Austen Society of North America, and there is a Massachusetts chapter. We hold about 6 talks a year on topics ranging from how happy are Jane Austen's endings anyway, to loving and loathing in Jane Austen, to Austen's London, and adapting Austen. And our talks are hybrid, so You don't have to get out the carriage to brave the 50 miles of good road, as Mr. Darcy would say. The information, the websites are there, and I'm going to hand out also, I have information on all of the things I'll cite, and it also has the websites here. So, before I plunge into the heart of my talk, I'm going to take another poll. How many people love the musical West Side Story? Okay. That was a trick question. I just wanted to make sure that there aren't a lot of folks who disapprove of adaptations, because there are those kind of people, very purist. As you know, West Side Story is an adaptation of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And in fact, Shakespeare based his play on the narrative poem, this is not working right. Okay, it's not animating. All right, well, he based his play on the narrative poem, The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet, which is an adaptation of a French story, itself derived from an Italian novella. And all of these are essentially adaptations of Ovid's story of Pyramus and Thisbe. And this reminds me of Calvin Trillin's observation that the most remarkable thing about his mother was that for 30 years she served the family nothing but leftovers. The original meal has never been found. So I don't remember how I joined the party of people using Austen for their original meal. I know I was thinking about ways to write about my late wife. Tried working on poems, which is my usual genre, but that didn't quite go anywhere. Aside from some attempts in grade school, I've never written fiction, unless you count those grant applications, you know, where you say how you're going to cure cancer and end world hunger with $1,500. I've written a lot of that fiction. But you know, fiction requires so many decisions, the plot, the characters, the time period, the setting, that it always has felt beyond my skill set. But somehow I began to think about how using somebody else's plot and characters would not be nearly as hard. And Calvin Trellin also said that every good idea, sooner or later, degenerates into hard work. So true. And it began innocently enough. At first I just started making notes in my copy of Persuasion. And how many of you have either read Persuasion or seen the movie? Good. So my idea was to turn the character of Captain Wentworth into a woman and make the reason that she and Anne split up is because Anne is persuaded that her staying involved with a woman and coming out would devastate her family. And I thought that showing the consequences of homophobia, internalized and otherwise, would be well served by this story. And since not everybody has read the book, just so you know, the main thing is that Captain Wentworth and Anne Elliot fall in love. She's the daughter of a widowed baronet, and he, when they first meet, is a young, not rich naval captain, and her mother's best friend, who's like her surrogate mother, persuades her to ditch him because he has nothing but himself to recommend him. Like, yeah, what else do any of us have? But so that is the sort of complication, and then they meet 8.5 years later. So and part of the story takes place in Bath and part in Lyme, and I felt like using persuasion to tell a little bit of a cubist version of my romance, and my wife's romance would be fitting because we were both big Austen fans, and we even took a trip like following in her footsteps to all these places. So I discussed the idea of adapting persuasion with some friends, and they were so excited that we decided to meet up in Old Lyme, Connecticut for a weekend to make the project more real, since I thought that the Lyme part of the novel would be set there. And like Tennyson, who demanded on arriving in Lyme, "Show me the spot where Louisa Musgrove fell." That's one of the other characters. I wanted to figure out where my Louisa would fall. Unfortunately, I didn't find anything that looked remotely dangerous there. And I thought maybe she'd have to get whacked on the head by a sailboat boom or something. And unlike Mr. Elliot in the original, who's her cousin, we weren't shy about talking with the other people at the inn where we stayed, and we ended up talking with a couple about a book called The Three Weissmans of Westport, which is pretty much the New York Jewish version of Sense and Sensibility.
Oh, wow.
And that became one of my aspirational examples of how to adapt Austen. A novel that stands completely on its own merits, but is really enriched by the fascinating counterpoint between the original and the retelling. And of course I was familiar, and I'm sure you are too, with various film updates of Austen, including Clueless, the Beverly Hills teen version of Emma, From Prada to Nada, the East LA Chicana version of Sense and Sensibility, I Have Found It, the Tamil language version of Sense and Sensibility, and the many interpretations of Pride and Prejudice, among them Bridget Jones's Diary, Bride and Prejudice, the Bollywood P&P, and possibly the least well-known retelling, Pride and Prejudice, a latter-day comedy. Yes, a Mormon version. I had no idea, though, how many people were motivated to adapt Austen. I mean, there are hundreds, possibly thousands of adaptations. And it turns out that the cottage industry of Austen adaptations began as early as 1913 with Old Friends and New Fancies by Sybil G. Brinton, whose book mixes and matches among all the novels, and resulting in the following couplings. And I put their birth novel in the parenthesis. So we have Colonel Fitzwilliam from Pride and Prejudice, marries Mary Crawford from Mansfield Park, Georgiana Darcy and William Price, Isabella Thorpe and Tom Bertram, and Kitty Bennett and James Moreland. So I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure we could have an entire lecture on the plausibility or desirability of these pairings, or suggestions for other options. As Jane Austen herself writes at the end of Persuasion, when any two young people take it into their heads to marry, they are pretty sure by perseverance to carry their point, be they ever so poor, or ever so imprudent, or ever so little likely to be necessary to each other's ultimate comfort. And it seems that the same can be said of many authors when they take it into their heads to marry disparate characters. And I want to give a shout out to a wonderful 1989 article by Kathleen Glancy called "What Happened Next?" or "The Many Husbands of Georgiana Darcy," which discusses in a delightfully snarky way the variety of Austen adaptations, including Brinton's, and the resulting farrago of duos. And you know, if you start reading a bunch of these, like then you have to like keep it straight. Oh no, they're not married in this one, they're married in that one, or he's dead in this one, but he's still alive in that one. So it's, you know, you really have to almost keep a spreadsheet. So one of the most amazing contemporary adaptations involving crossovers between the novels is the series by Sonali Day, and I think at least one of them you have here in the library. She has adopted 4 of the novels, and they feature different members of the Indian American Rajay family in each book. And we glimpse the other members and their stories in all the books. Her characters are really complex and believable for the most part. I mean, one of them is a little too magical realism for me, but it's unfortunately the romance novel kind of language that gets in the way of these being as compelling as they might be. And, you know, I have a feeling that a lot of the adaptations, you know, if you just like go and look them up, they all have that sort of bodice ripper cover. I have a feeling that they might have that kind of language as well. I think it's really a funny coincidence that in both her adaptation of Persuasion, which is set in the Bay Area, and Brienne Moore's adaptation, All Stirred Up, which is set in Edinburgh, in both of them, the Anne Elliot character is a restaurateur. What is the likelihood of that? You'll be relieved to know that my Anne Elliot character is a social worker. And I want to especially recommend the audiobook of All Stirred Up. It really brings the vivid characters to life with a variety of different accents. It's very wonderful. So speaking of restaurants in Austen retellings, Curtis Sittenfeld's Eligible, which is Pride and Prejudice set mostly in Cincinnati, features a number of scenes in local skyline chili locations, though the characters are just patrons, they're not the proprietors. Eligible is for me a very successful adaptation, like the Three Weissmans of Westport, and that it really has a life of its own without requiring knowledge of the original, though it's really very much enhanced by the counterpoint. So imagine, if you will, Lizzie and Darcy engaging in hate sex after jogging compared to their interactions in the original. Eligible is part of a series of modern retellings called the Austen Project from HarperCollins, which also includes Northanger Abbey by the Scottish crime novelist Val McDermid. Pardon me. There are two reviews that have the opposite assessments. One writer notes that McDermid's crime writing credentials on paper are perfect for the young amateur sleuth Catherine Morland, with her silly head filled with Gothic fiction. To be concise, it doesn't work unless you like your fiction overtly teenage-based and characters gratingly irritating. I mean, to my mind, that actually kind of describes the original. And the reviewer continues, Austen's original, the first she ever wrote, was never published in her lifetime. McDermid's rewrite should perhaps have followed suit. On the other hand, novelist and memoirist Jeanette Winterson says that the adaptation is funny, clever, subversive, and Scottish. No bonnets, all brio. So, no bonnets, all brio. That's a good aspiration, I would say, for adaptations. So, Joanna Trollope's adaptation of Sense and Sensibility was the first entry in the series. And I just, she just died, and I read her obituary this morning, and so this is what it says about her adapting Austen. In 2013, she tried her hand at a modern retelling of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, but she hardly expected to match the master. The comparison to Jane Austen makes me fidget, she told The Independent. There is a huge gulf between being great and being good. I know exactly which category I fall into and which she falls into. They are not the same. On a good day, I might be good. So, I think all of us who are trying, even if we're not, doing bodice ripping versions, we all know that we're not at Jane's level. Here is what one reviewer wrote, and it was representative of many of the assessments, and I think it's also a useful way to think about contemporary adaptations in general. So this one said, modernizing Austen to me doesn't mean using the exact same conflicts, tossing in a couple of trendy words to decorate the exact same dialogue, and exchanging the corsets for iPod headphones. To me, it's writing it so that a young person who has no idea about the plot/characters can pick it up, understand it, without having to refer to a dictionary for words like entail, and appreciate the conflicts/hardships the characters are enduring. Instead, we get bad fanfic. So more on fan fiction in a moment. So Emma, the remaining book in the series, was assigned to the Scottish writer Alexander McCall Smith, known for the #1 ladies detective agency. Alas, the New York Times reviewer wrote, forget Pride and Prejudice and zombies. McCall Smith's Emma reads like an Austen novel written by zombies. He didn't paste that in his scrapbook, I don't think. So it may be that he and others did what I did, which was essentially download the text of the original and do a bunch of searching and replacing. And for me, this was very helpful in terms of just beginning to envision my characters in the story. But I think sometimes authors forget to go back and adjust when and where and how to veer from the original. So what I will call the search and replace school of adaptations or retellings is not always successful in lifting off from the original. On the other hand, some people don't really seem to care about a story's ability to live on its own outside the original novel's womb. Many of those readers just want more of an immersive experience in the classic. And that is what I came to learn is the world of fan fiction. So fan fiction requires knowledge of the canon, the original, and sometimes it's not a separate story at all. Maybe it's the same story from a different character's perspective, or an imagined prequel or sequel to the original. So some examples include Regina Jeffords's Captain Wentworth's Persuasion, which offers obviously his point of view instead of Anne Elliot's. Joe Baker's Longbourn, which is kind of the downstairs version to Pride and Prejudice's Upstairs. Later Days at Highbury, which is an epistolary postscript to Emma, written by Jane Austen Lee, Jane Austen's great-grandniece, which updates us on all the post-Emma Highbury happenings through letters between Mrs. Goddard and her sister. And speaking of epistolary fan fiction, I highly recommend Joanna O'Connor's Lizzie and Darcy in Lockdown. You may recall Lady Catherine's bragging in Pride and Prejudice about the pianoforte, and she said, "If I had ever learned, I should have been a great proficient." During this imagined correspondence, which takes place during a pandemic lockdown, Lizzie writes to Darcy, who is sequestered with Lady Catherine at Rosings, P.P.S. I wonder, is this not a perfect opportunity for Lady Catherine to learn the pianoforte? So you can see the benefit, the sort of in-joke of knowing the original. So there is alternative universe fan fiction, such as Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, or Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters. I haven't personally explored these universes, but I understand they're popular. Anybody read any of those? I think that the library has the zombie one. There is also time travel fan fiction. So Lost in Austen is an example of that, with Lizzie Bennet and a modern Londoner switching places and all of the complications of that genre ensuing. I am not exactly sure what category of fan fiction or adaptations murder mysteries fall into, but there's plenty of it when it comes to Jane Austen. So Tirzah Price has a whole series of Jane Austen mysteries, Manslaughter Park. Stephanie Barron has a series in which Jane Austen herself is the sleuth, and I think you have that here as well, or one of them. And Stephanie was one of the speakers we had for the Jane Austen Society of Massachusetts. So that's another type of speaker we have. And I am sure many P.D. James and Jane Austen fans thought that their literary love child, Death Comes to Pemberley, would be a wonderful offspring. Unfortunately, it is terrible. I mean, right off the bat, there's the wrong number of Bennet daughters, and there's so many historical anachronisms. It's painful. Don't read it. Read all her other, all P.D. James' other books. I think she was, very, very old when she wrote this. I mean, I know she was an Austen fan. I mean, one of the characters is that Adam Dalgliesh falls in love with is Emma Lavenham and blah, blah. Anyway, there is a whole new series of Austen adjacent murder mysteries called the Mr. Darcy and Miss Tilney Mystery Series by Claudia Gray. And the sleuths here are the offspring of Darcy and Lizzie from Pride and Prejudice, and of Catherine Morland and Henry Tilney of Northanger Abbey. And an interesting twist for me, at least, is that Jonathan Darcy, the Mr. Darcy of Sleuth, is portrayed as being neurodivergent. And it brought to mind what Mr. Darcy, his father, says in response to Lizzie's question, shall we ask him why a man of sense and education who has lived in the world is ill qualified to recommend himself to strangers? And he says, I certainly have not the talent which some people possess of conversing easily with those I've never seen before. I cannot catch their tone of conversation or appear interested in their concerns, as I often see done. So I don't know if that is what inspired the author to make his son neurodivergent or not. There is a sub-genre of fan fiction called fix-it fic, which rewrites the original to fix things that the fan fiction author dislikes or wants to fix. And when I read from my manuscript, there'll be some references to some of the works that I've mentioned today and the places where those authors fix some aspect of the original. And there is a genre of fanfic called fem/, or sapphic, which focuses on romantic or sexual relationships between female fictional characters who are heterosexual in their original context, and obviously my retelling could fall under that category. So what are some common pitfalls and challenges of adaptations? The characters of many historical adaptations can feel pretty stilted, or conversely, as if they are acting and speaking like contemporary characters who happen to be wearing a bonnet and pelisse. On the other hand, bringing stories into the present can have its own lack of believability. So, for instance, how many adults end up living with their family of origin forever, like so many of Austen's characters? And so that requires some ingenuity to make that plausible. There's also sex how do you incorporate it when the whole point of many of the originals is not to be having it? The level of openness about our feelings and our actions is another difficulty when trying to replicate some aspects of the originals. So you can think about the entirety of Sense and Sensibility, which relies on Mrs. Dashwood and Eleanor not asking Marianne if she and Willoughby are engaged. I mean, now it would be on all over Twitter, right? So how can we replicate the ability to remain long uninformed about things in our age of instant communication? Although hypochondriacs are pretty easy and fun to update, medical crises can be more problematic. Jane's cold, which conveniently keeps her and Lizzie at Netherfield for like a week or so, couldn't possibly interfere with 21st century activities. And Louisa's fall, should it result in a concussion or serious head injury that requires months of rehab? I mean, there's a lot of calculus there. Along with the hypochondriacs, narcissists are still very familiar and pretty easy to update. And in fact, though I wouldn't characterize Wickham as a malignant narcissist, the question that Lizzie asks Darcy when she discovers that Lydia has run off with Wickham, how is such a man to be worked on? That is a question I find running through my head almost daily in the last 9 years. Though I had admired some historical fan fiction before I even heard the term, I knew I personally could not pull off 18th or 19th century world, especially when my purpose was to highlight the love story of two women and the negative consequences of being closeted. Plus, I love the dimensionality, as I mentioned, that comes from the counterpoint and sort of call and response between the original story and characters and the modern adaptation. So my own version is set firmly in this century, though I haven't quite settled on what year. And in fact, I created an Excel spreadsheet. Jane had one too, I know, to be able to easily consider different options. So I can put in different years for the present. The present there is circled in yellow. And it then will compute how old everybody is. I mean, I can also change what year somebody was born. For my story, it was important that the lovers met at a time when being gay was still stigmatized, and I wanted the contrast to be apparent with the book's present, so I put in the years when gay marriage was legalized here in Massachusetts, and in the US as part of the timeline. I also really enjoyed creating a chart of equivalence for the characters. I obviously had to flip at least one character's gender in order for this to be about a lesbian romance, but I ended up switching a number just because I felt like the characters would work better. So Sir Walter Elliot becomes Ellie Walters, and Lady Russell becomes Russell Mann. John Shepherd becomes Jan Shepherd, and Clay Shepherd is her son. Admiral Croft becomes Merle Croft, and so on. And it was especially fun that I realized when I realized that Sir Walter was actually my stepmother. So I feel like I've done enough talking about the idea of adapting Austen, and I'm gonna end by reading from my own adaptation called Her Persuasion. And I will plan to read like 3 excerpts or 4 if there's time. But feel free to get up and get your cake and tea, during this time.